She wasn't the fragile figure some retellings imply. She wasn't simply broken by the end. She wasn't a helpless woman trapped beside a fanatical husband. She was the regime's most polished symbol of family, the woman who helped sell a myth of purity to a nation. And in the final hours, when the empire collapsed into a bunker, she made a choice that still stops language in the throat. This is the story people soften into tragedy, because the truth is harder to hold. The dark truth about Magda Goebbels. And the choice history can't forgive. If you value calm, long-form World War II stories that go deeper than headlines, you can like the video and subscribe to wwii Diaries. Now, back to the story. In the Third Reich, power didn't only live in offices and uniforms, it lived in images, photographs, table settings, children's smiles arranged like evidence. And for years, Magda Goebbels was that evidence. To millions, she looked like the first lady of a new Germany, elegant, composed, devoted. A mother surrounded by 6 children, a living poster for the future the regime promised. That image mattered more than it should have, because the regime didn't only demand obedience, it demanded intimacy. It wanted citizens to feel the ideology in their homes, at their dinner tables, in the way they imagined their children growing up. So the state borrowed the oldest human language of all, family, and Magda became one of its most convincing speakers. But the final act of her life reveals what that image was really for. Not comfort, not stability, control. When an ideology turns family into propaganda, it eventually asks the family to die for the propaganda. Berlin, April 1945. The world above ground is collapsing into fire and rubble. Soviet artillery shakes the city day and night. The Third Reich is no longer an empire. It is a sealed space underground with failing lights and thinning air. Inside that space, the inner circle faces a problem it cannot solve. Not how to win. That is over. The problem is meaning. How to explain their lives after defeat. How to survive the future. Because the future is not just time. The future is judgment. For ordinary Germans, the future means hunger and shame and rebuilding. For the people who built the regime, the future could mean testimony, records, faces, names, trials. And that is why the world after becomes the most terrifying phrase in the bunker. Not because it will be hard, because it will be clarifying. It will force a question they train themselves never to ask. What were we, really? In witness accounts of the bunker, in diaries, and in later reconstructions, a theme repeats again and again. A world without national socialism is treated as unlivable, not merely dangerous, unlivable. That belief is the engine of the final decisions. And it is the belief Magda expresses in the most extreme way imaginable. Because the choice she made was not only about fear, it was about identity, and identity under collapse becomes ruthless. Silence was part of the decision. To understand how that silence formed, we have to go back. Not to the bunker first, but to the image. Because the image came before the poison. The image came before the locked doors. The image came before the last night. And the image trained everyone watching to misunderstand what they were seeing. The Goebbels household was never only a household, it was a stage. Joseph Goebbels was the Reich's master of narrative. He understood something brutally modern. People don't obey only because they fear punishment. They obey because the story feels true. So the regime didn't only show tanks, it showed babies. It didn't only show flags, it showed mothers. And Magda Goebbels was the perfect casting. She had the poise of a society woman, the charm of a hostess, the discipline of someone who understood appearances as survival. In a regime obsessed with mythology, she looked like mythology. But the darkness here is not the image itself. The darkness is what the image was designed to do. It was designed to make the ideology feel domestic, to place it inside ordinary life, to make it feel like love. When a system calls itself a family, it usually means it wants your loyalty without your questions. Magda's proximity to Hitler amplified the illusion. In public, Hitler cultivated an image of separation, a leader married to the nation, above ordinary attachments. That made Magda even more useful. She could appear publicly as the feminine center of the regime, without threatening Hitler's crafted solitude. She wasn't merely a minister's wife, she was a substitute symbol. She hosted, she smiled, She stood near the center of power and made that center look human. Yet inside the inner circle, human was not innocence. Human was strategy. Power doesn't always need cruelty in the open. Sometimes it needs warmth in the frame. The Goebbels children were part of that frame, not as individuals with futures of their own, but as proof that the Reich was fertile, clean, eternal. This is the first uncomfortable truth many viewers resist. In propaganda states, children can become political objects long before they understand politics. They become proof. They become reassurance. They become tools. And once a child is treated as a tool, the adult holding the tool starts to believe something dangerous, that the child's life belongs to the mission. Magda's identity fused with that mission over years. Her status depended on it. Her social world depended on it. Her sense of meaning depended on it. Even her sense of self as mother was filtered through it. Because motherhood in this regime was not only nurture, it was function. The more a system praises motherhood, the more it may be asking mothers to serve the system first. Now pause and notice what that means in the final days. If the family is propaganda, what happens when the propaganda collapses? What happens when cameras disappear? When parades end? When the myth breaks? A normal mother facing defeat clings to her children as the reason to live. But a mother whose identity has been built as an ideological symbol faces a different terror. If the ideology dies, what am I? And the second terror is even worse. If my children live after the ideology dies, what does that say about everything we claimed? In the bunker, the family is no longer useful to the public, but it is still useful to the inner circle. Because the inner circle needs one last message, one last proof, one last image they can carry into the end. Not for the world, for themselves. So the family is transformed from public symbol into private statement. And private statements inside collapsing systems can be lethal. Silence was part of the decision, because speaking the obvious truth would have shattered the last remaining identity in that room, that their devotion meant something. By late April 1945, Berlin is no longer a capital. It is a cratered labyrinth of smoke. The Soviet ring tightens. Messages stop arriving. Phones go quiet. The Reich is reduced to maps that cannot be obeyed. And inside the bunker, something happens that often happens at the end of violent systems. People stop thinking in plans. They start thinking in sentences. Short, hard sentences that make unbearable reality feel organized. No future, no alternative, no life after this. Better the end than the aftermath. These sentences are not neutral. They are permissions. The most dangerous weapon in the bunker was not a gun. It was a belief about the future. Magda's final reasoning is often summarized as maternal despair, but accounts around the bunker repeatedly point to ideology, not merely emotion, not "I can't bear the pain," but "they must not live in the world that comes next." That is a fundamentally different logic, because pain is personal, but the world that comes next is political. It is a verdict on society, a verdict on democracy, a verdict on defeat, a verdict on humiliation. And humiliation is a powerful driver in authoritarian collapse, especially among elites who believe they embody destiny. Collapse does not only destroy buildings, it destroys self-image, and people will do almost anything to protect a self-image. Consider the position of the Goebbels family at that moment. Joseph Goebbels is not an anonymous official. He is the voice of the regime, the man who told the nation what to feel, what to fear, what to hate, what to hope. If the regime dies, his words don't disappear. They remain as evidence. So the future is not simply difficult, it is personal exposure. And that exposure extends to the family. A surviving family would become a living contradiction, a living question, a living reminder that the myth ended in failure. For true believers, the idea of children growing up in a defeated Germany, a Germany that condemns everything the parents served, can feel like a kind of psychic annihilation. So the mind reaches for control, not control over events. Events are already lost. Control over meaning, control over how the story ends. That is why the bunker becomes a theater, not a public theater with cameras, a private theater where the audience is the inner circle. And in that theater, certain words cannot be spoken. You cannot say, "We were wrong." You cannot say we destroyed everything. You cannot say our children deserve a future beyond our ideology, because saying that would tear the final protective layer off the self. So silence does what it always does inside power. It makes the unthinkable easier. In some rooms, silence is not absence. Silence is agreement. In the last days, witness accounts describe moments of eerie routine. Meals, cigarettes, waiting, small conversations that sound almost normal. That normality is not comfort. It is evidence of compartmentalization. The human skill that allows people to commit or enable horrors while still performing ordinary life. Compartmentalization does not mean ignorance. It means separation. A bunker can make separation feel like sanity because the outside world is unbearable. So the mind builds a smaller world it can survive. And within that smaller world, the most important thing becomes a story that can be endured. This is why the later private tragedy frame spreads so easily. It gives the audience a survivable story too. But survivable stories often hide the mechanism. The mechanism here is ideological loyalty, turned into final control over the powerless. Silence was part of the decision, because naming the true mechanism would force the question that history keeps returning to. Was this mercy? Or was it a final act of devotion to the regime, performed on children who had no choice? After Hitler's death on April 30th, 1945, the bunker changes temperature, not physically, psychologically. A strange clarity settles. The Führer is gone. The center has collapsed. And suddenly the people remaining are no longer acting for victory. They are acting for the ending. When the leader dies, the system doesn't stop. It searches for a final shape. Joseph Goebbels makes his own decision soon after. But the decision that still haunts the bunker story is Magda's. Because it is intimate, not military or not strategic. Intimate choices are harder to hide behind duty. And the bunker was built for hiding. Concrete corridors, heavy doors, small rooms that seal off sound. A structure designed to survive bombs also survives conscience. Inside, the children are still children. They are not generals. They are not ideologues. They do not understand the sentences the adults are repeating. They only feel the atmosphere. They feel the tension, the fear, the quiet, the way adults speak softly and stop mid-sentence. And then, at some point, the adults decide not to let them wake into the future. The details of how it was carried out have been debated and reconstructed through testimony and investigation. Accounts differ, some elements are disputed, and that matters because the uncertainty creates space for myth. But uncertainty does not erase responsibility. Disputed details can protect a story, but they do not protect the dead. What remains consistent across the records is not a perfect timeline. It is the moral structure, a belief about the future, a need to control the narrative, a willingness to transfer the cost to the powerless. And there is a reason later retellings often drift towards softness, because softness makes the act emotionally digestible. Tragic, unbearable, merciful. But these words can become a second bunker, a bunker built in language, a place where the listener can hide from the reality. That ideology does not always end by killing enemies. Sometimes it ends by consuming its own symbols. And if the family was one of the regime's symbols, the family becomes the final offering. The most unsettling part is the quiet. Not a battlefield, not a city square, not a crowd. A closed space, a controlled environment, a decision implemented without debate loud enough to interrupt it. That is what power looks like when it is afraid. It does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. The final cruelty of a collapsing system is often administrative, calm, routine, necessary. After the children's deaths, the bunker does not erupt into moral rebellion. It continues. That continuation is one of the darkest details, because it shows how far the group has traveled from ordinary human instinct. The instinct that says, protect children at any cost. But in the bunker, a different rule has replaced instinct. Protect the meaning of the regime at any cost. Silence was part of the decision, because if someone had named what was happening with plain words, not euphemism, not tragedy, not fate, the room would have been forced to see itself, and seeing itself was what it could not survive. After the war, the world needed clarity. It needed a way to condemn the Third Reich without hesitation. It needed moral lines that could be drawn cleanly. But the bunker stories created a problem because they showed something worse than monsters shouting. They showed people speaking softly, sharing meals, using gentle words for lethal choices. They showed how evil can wear the mask of family. The most frightening evil is not always screaming. Sometimes it is tender language used to justify the unforgivable. So the story of Magda Goebbels often gets processed into a single frame. A mother driven mad by defeat. That frame does something important. It makes the act feel isolated, private, psychological, and it quietly detaches it from ideology. But the evidence spine around the bunker repeatedly points back to ideology, to the belief that the world after the Reich was not worth living in. That belief is not a private breakdown. It is a political sentence. And if it is political, the act becomes political too. Not in the sense of strategy, in the sense of meaning, it becomes the final attempt to control the narrative. A last statement that says, "We do not accept your future. We reject your judgment. We will not allow our symbols, our children, to live as evidence against us." That is why the act is not only tragic, it is revealing, because it shows what the regime trained loyalty to become a willingness to destroy the powerless, to avoid facing the aftermath. When a system collapses, some people run to survive. Others destroy what they once used to prove they were right. And this is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable for modern audiences, because it forces a question that reaches beyond 1945. How many atrocities are enabled not by open hatred, but by the quiet decision to look away? How many crimes are normalized not by sadism, but by the gentle voice that says, there is no alternative? Magda Goebbels never commanded armies. She didn't sign laws and she didn't run camps. But she lived at the center of a regime built on extermination and domination. And she helped present its face as wholesome. Her complicity was not in paperwork. It was in presence, in belonging, in loyalty displayed as virtue. And at the end, that loyalty became an act performed on children. That is why history can't forgive it. Not because history enjoys condemnation, but because the victims here had no agency at all. They didn't choose ideology. They didn't choose the bunker. They didn't choose the sentences the adults repeated. They were simply where power landed when it needed an ending it could control. Silence was part of the decision, and silence tried to survive after the war too. Through euphemisms, through softened retellings, through the comforting word tragedy used as a curtain. But the curtain never fully closes, because the central fact remains. A mother chose to end her children's lives because she could not accept a world without the regime. That is not only despair, that is ideological loyalty turned into final control. And if you sit with that without flinching, another question emerges, quietly, relentlessly. If a system can teach people to call this mercy, what else can it teach them to call mercy? The dark truth is not only what happened in the bunker, it's what the bunker required not to name. So the people inside could keep believing they were loyal, not guilty. And the last question is the one the story leaves behind. Unresolved, heavy, impossible to make comforting. When defeat comes, what do we cling to? Life or the story that made our life feel meaningful? And if you've stayed with me to the end, I'd like to hear something simple. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or anywhere else. And if someone in your family served, tell us. We read every story.